An 11-year-old boy wakes up to find his mother missing. His search for evidence about where she went will lead the cops directly to his father. This is the Noreen Boyle story. Hello, Meghan.
Hello, Amy, and
Hi, Collier.
Hi, how are you?
Hey, this is the first time we have a friend joining us on one of our video episodes. So I am super excited. You want to just introduce yourself instead of me introducing you? I guess that makes sense.
I am, well, first of all, I'm honored to be your first guest on your video episode, your first third party, I suppose. And I am that 11-year-old boy you were describing.
You look really old for your age.
I do, but I feel that same age inside. So it's about what inside that counts. That's what I was told. So, but no, my name is Collier Landry. I am also a podcaster, filmmaker, and I'm so glad that you ladies have had me on to share this story. I just did a new podcast with Sony called Finding Mom's Killer. I have my own show, the Collier Landry Show, and I've talked about the lingering effects of childhood trauma on mental health and into adulthood and all of these things that we're going to get into in this episode about where that trauma all originates from. But
Yes.
I appreciate you guys having me on here and allowing me to have this platform to speak to your audience. And hello, Women in Crime audience. Thank you for embracing me.
Yes. Thank you for being here. And the podcast that you mentioned, it's called Finding Mom's Killer, did you say?
Yes, correct.
Okay, I have that cited at the end because I listened to it. It was incredibly done. I listened to the whole podcast as part of my source material for today's episode. So we are very excited to have Collier here. He will be able to shed a lot of light on the story and also on the aftermath, and we'll go through the whole thing. So before we get to Collier, let's go ahead and meet his mother, Noreen Boyle. I couldn't find much on her childhood publicly, but again, we have Collier here to help us out. But I'll tell you what I did find. Noreen was born in Philadelphia in 1945, and when she was 16 years old, she met a 19-year-old Navy man named Jack, also known as John Boyle. The two began dating and both went to attend the University of Pennsylvania. Jack was in the university's medical school, and Noreen was in the dental school. After graduating, Noreen worked as a dental hygienist and supported Jack through the rest of his medical school. They got married not long after, and they moved to several different places, including Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Pensacola, Florida, and Dahlgren, Virginia, before finally settling in Mansfield, Ohio. In February of 1978, the couple welcomed their first child, Collier Landry Boyle. Hi.
Hi.
It's you. Then in 1989, they adopted a 3-year-old Taiwanese girl named Elizabeth. The Boyles lived a seemingly happy life in Ohio, where Jack owned his medical practice, and Noreen was a stay-at-home mom to Collier and Elizabeth. Collier, what do you remember about your mom?
Well, for me, I think the most vivid memory that comes with my mother is how caring and kind she was to everyone. And, my mother wasn't a pushover either. My mother wasn't didn't suffer fools. My mother was, raised in a German-Irish home and was very regimented in her studies growing up. And as you mentioned, she went to University of Pennsylvania. Both my parents went to University of Pennsylvania. My mother did graduate with a degree in dental hygienistry and then did support my father through his medical school journey. But she, while she was, a good mother and was very disciplined with me, she was also the kindest, sweetest person you could imagine, and caring, compassionate about other people. I always tell this story and usually it rings truer during the holidays, but my mother, every year for Christmas, around Christmas time, I would donate toys to Toys for Tots, right? And my mother would make me, my mother knew which toys I liked, which were my favorites. And I wasn't allowed just to pick the crappy toys that I didn't play with. I had to pick some that were special to me, that I loved, to give away. Because my mother was like, you need to realize that you're very fortunate. You have a mommy and daddy that love you. Santa always comes every year. Yes, I believed in Santa Claus. I found out after she died that Santa Claus didn't exist. But she wanted me to realize that I came from a place of privilege in a way of not because my father was, because I think a lot of people were under the impression that we lived in this big mansion and we had all this money. My father had just started making money when all of this happened, which is sort of adds even more to the story of just why do what he did, right? But my father was a doctor in the Navy for a very long time. We lived on I grew up the first 5 years of my life in Dahlgren, Virginia, on a naval base where the airplanes would land in the backyard and all that stuff. So, my father hadn't been in private practice for very long. And, but my mother wanted me to just realize that there are people in the world who don't have love or don't have a roof over their head. And even though what we were dealing with at home, not a lot of people really understood, which is that my father was very abusive. My father was a chronic womanizer. I didn't know this at the time, but later found out my father's a chronic womanizer. And on top of that, he's very abusive to my mother and I, verbally, physically, emotionally, and he's not around a lot, So my bond with my mother formed very early, as every son does with the mother, but it was like the two of us were like two peas in a pod, because it was kind of, we were, for part of that later part of my early childhood, we were in a fight or flight sort of scenario, because we never knew what version of Jekyll or Hyde was going to come through the door at night, and that's how I grew up. But my mother was a very compassionate and caring woman, and she loved everybody, and she just, so many people were devastated by her murder in the community, just because it was like, wow, like they took a good one away,
Yeah. Thank you for sharing more about her. So, as you mentioned, there was a dark side to your father, and your mother was also aware of some of the extramarital affairs, but from what I understand, she tolerated it for the sake of you and your sister, right? But this would all change at one point, correct?
Yeah, right around the time that my sister came into our home, because my sister was adopted 6 months before my mother was killed. So that was right around the time that I had found out about my father's girlfriend, or realized that this woman was a girlfriend, in fact.
Would you mind telling us a little bit about how that came to be?
Sure. So, as I testified at trial, I said, very hyperbolically, how much time did I spend with my mom? 99% with my mother, 1% with my father. But my sort of relationship with my father was, I would go on his medical rounds with him to the hospital, go visit patients with him. I remember going to Amish country quite a bit when we moved to Mansfield to see some of his patients with him. And we would go on ski trips together. That was something that we would do, but not much else. My father wasn't really around very much. He would come home very late at night. I always see him. If I came downstairs in the middle of the night, he'd be sleeping on the couch or watching CNN or whatever. When we moved to Mansfield, I met a lot of kids in my school that were children of divorce, or children of, single parents, or split joint custody households. And that was something I didn't really knew existed. And I knew that my parents' relationship, I was so young, but I knew that my parents' relationship probably wasn't what I thought it was. But I at least was like, oh, my father's home, my mother is home, and we do activities together from time to time. You know what I mean? And it doesn't seem like it's as bad as these other kids, right? But as far as the affairs and everything, I had no clue. And it wasn't until Memorial Day of 1989 that my father took me to this party in Madison Township, which is right outside of Mansfield. And went to this house, and it was a big party, and my parents were very East Coast. My mother and father were very preppy. It was they belonged to the yacht club up in Sandusky, Ohio. Like, they didn't belong to the country club in Mansfield. I think that was a little too much for them. But they had this sort of East Coast swagger, in a very Midwestern town. But I go to this party, and it was, they're racing quads, they're playing volleyball, kids running around bare feet, and, cooking the hog on the thing. And I meet this woman named Sherry, my father introduces me to, that he tells me is a patient of his. And we stayed there for hours. And I'm actually riding a quad for the first time, and Sherry let me drive, and she was on the back. And I remember going over a bridge, and I swerved, and she almost flew off the back of the quad. And I shudder to think like what would have happened if that had actually played out, how different my life would have been.
Wow.
Because I had no idea at the time she was pregnant. And but this woman named Sherry Campbell came around, and I remember towards the end of the evening that I was there, I look back and my father's walking around this lake, and he has his arm around her. And I asked him as we were leaving in the car ride home, I said, Daddy, what was that about, right? Not that I thought anything of it like it was uncouth, but I was like, what's going on with her? Because she was his, quote, patient. And he told me that she was terminally ill and he was consoling her. I was like, oh, okay.
Collier, you were about 10, 11 at this point?
I was 11, yeah.
11, okay.
I was 11, and I was like, oh, okay. And I didn't think anything of it, So flash forward a month later to June, it's Father's Day. And my father takes me to go to his office, and he's going to come back, and this is obviously the late 80s, so the suntan parlors are in, and so he was going to go get a tan. Mm-hmm. We stop at the tanning salon, and out comes Sherry, and he's like, oh, Sherry, and she has 2 radio-controlled cars that she gives us for Father's Day. And so I'm playing with the radio-controlled car, and I look up, and I see my father making out with her. And I had never seen my parents kiss like that. And I was like, what is going on? So we get in the car, and before I can say anything, my father, he says, look, Bumper, it's my nickname he gave me as a child. He says, don't tell Mommy about Sherry. I want you to tell her that, I took you to my office. I gave you the radio control cars as a present for getting good grades. And of course, I was in fear of my father a lot. He was very abusive to me growing up. So I was already afraid, and I didn't want to say what I thought was, I didn't want to tell my mother what was going on. I realized it was better for me to comply, right? Because I had seen, especially earlier in the year when my mother had went to China or Taiwan to visit my sister and her family to sort of arrange the adoption, that my father was very, very violent and would be very, very violent with me because my protector was gone, and so your abuser takes over when your protector's gone, as happens with these types of things. So I was in fear of my father. So, of course, I did what he said. But that night, I was so overwhelmed with the guilt. I had never lied to my mother before, especially in that way. And I knew it was wrong, right? I knew it was wrong. And I told her the next day, I said, Mommy, I said, and I was so overwhelmed with guilt. And I said to her, what happened? I said, I think Daddy has a girlfriend. But of course, unbeknownst to me, my mother already knew this. Mm-hmm. And she already knew that Sherry was pregnant. So she was aware of all this so back to your original question or statement, which was, there was an understanding between my parents, of course, unbeknownst to me, that my father could do whatever he wanted to do. He had multiple affairs behind my mother's back for decades, apparently. I mean, he was engaged to nurses he worked with. He was in romantic relationships all the time with people. And he was married and had a family. And the stories was my wife died or whatever. It's so odd because it's such a small town, Mansfield. It's at that time, 30,000 people. So it's not hard to figure these things out. But yeah, he had all these. And so, but for my mother, the line in the sand was, you do whatever you want. Do not involve our son.
Yeah. I'm very curious. Why do you think he felt it necessary to do that in front of you? Was it a power play, or was it just a disregard?
That's an interesting question, but I would kick it back to you guys as criminologists. Why do you think he did that?
Well, was there any attempt to at least hide this kiss, or was it directly in front of you?
It was very overt. It was very overt.
Yeah.
The thing is, and this is very sad to say about one's father, but I think anything that my father does is very intentional and very calculated.
Yeah.
So for him to do that in front of me. I mean, it was probably very well thought out.
Yeah.
Know?
So
and
I think
it was probably done to upset you and to put you in that awful situation of, do I tell my mom, do I not? Definitely that's something that stuck out to me also when we think about like why these things happen and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So as I understand it, Collier, she then filed for divorce, and this was in November of 1989. And a few days prior to that, actually, your father and Sherry signed a contract for a home in Erie, Pennsylvania, which was about 175 miles away from Mansfield.
Yeah.
And Sherry signed it as Mrs. Boyle.
Yeah, I believe. Now, again, none of this, all this is unbeknownst to me at the time, but I believe, looking at the Forensic Files episode, she signed it. And I remember asking Sherry about this because this came up in the thing. She signed it N. Sherry Boyle. So my mother's initials were NSB, Noreen Schmid Boyle. So N. Sherry Boyle, but she was not married to my father. And, I should mention too, in that meeting at the tanning salon, something else that has stood out, this was a key component, is Sherry had on a ring. And it was a very unique ring because my mother had it. It was a diamond slide ring. So it had a shaft that this diamond moved back and forth. And my father had given it to her a couple years earlier. But I'd never really seen my mom wear it very much. But I remember her being very excited when she got it. Later found out that engagement, that was used as an engagement ring for many different women, which is why my mother stopped wearing it. But my father had given that to Sherry. And I said to her, my mommy has a ring like that. Because it was so unique. I'd never seen anyone else with a ring like that. And she just kind of giggled and looked at my father. So I think that for her, yes, she felt that she was engaged. She was going to be married to this doctor and she was going to have this wonderful life and they were going to buy this big house and everything. But yes, she signed the documents. She claimed, and she told me that the realtor left the office to go, I don't know, photocopy paperwork or whatever. And he said, quick, sign, put an initial N in front of your name. And she was like, what? She didn't understand. And so he was manipulated. She was manipulated into putting the N before her name. Who knows if that's true or not, but that was her. That's what she told me. So yeah, she signed these documents and I had no idea that my mom had finally filed for divorce in November. I thought it was much sooner, but you find all these things out later. But it was definitely like they are getting a divorce. And over those 6 months between, this is, as I said, this is, mid-June 1989, and then obviously up until the murder, my father is building, there's kind of splitting time with me, and my father is telling me things like, he is going to build this wonderful life with Sherry and her wonderful children, and how much better they are than I am, how my mother and I are going to be living in poverty when he's done with us. I will never go to college. He will make sure of it. We will live this, he's going to ship my sister back to China. He's going to throw our lives into upheaval because how dare we break up the family and this, that, and the other. Like, classic narcissistic abuser, psychopathy, victim mentality, and this is, this sort of becomes the narrative that carries throughout my life with him,
Yeah.
So as you're mentioning, your father continued living with you and your mother sometimes, like throughout the holidays. The divorce proceedings were continuing. Things were a bit contentious. Your parents were probably fighting over everything from alimony, child support, credit card debt. And around this time, on December 30th, Jack's mother, your grandmother, Christine, came to spend time for New Year's.
Yeah.
Correct.
So my grandmother, my father's mother, was very close to my mother. They were like sisters. You would think that she was like her mom because my mother was not close with her mother, who had passed away a couple of years earlier, was not particularly close to her. She was closer to my grandfather, her father. But yeah, they had this very wonderful relationship. And my grandmother, my father's mother, had a daughter as well, but she wasn't particularly close with her either. So they got along. They loved fashion. They loved art. They loved music. So they were passionate about the same thing. So they just really hit it off from when my mother was a child, or not child, but teenager when meeting my father. So my grandmother was supposed to come Christmas to stay with us, but I think she had pneumonia. She was 75 at the time, but she came for New Year's, which even then she wasn't feeling great. But my father drug her to the house. So, yeah.
And so that'll kind of take us to that evening.
Yes.
She was sleeping over that night. From what I understand, you were woken up to some noises around 3 a.m. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how that all played out?
Yeah. So essentially, I was woken up in the middle of the night to, I think what I heard was a scream, and I think it was from my sister maybe. And then I heard two loud thuds, and they were separated by about like 60 to 90 seconds apart. And I could hear between those thuds. And this is like, as I described in the courtroom, and honestly, it sounded like a body hitting a wall. It was this hollow boom, very jarring sound. And my, sorry, I just thought of something. It's interesting when you think back to these moments, you're like, oh, but what was that was actually happening in that moment? You know what I'm saying? So between these thuds, I hear my father like murmuring, but I recognize his voice. And everything inside of me is I'm laying in bed and I'm like playing the whole scenario out. Do I get up and go look? Well, okay, I'm an asthmatic little kid, whose father is 6'3", 230 pounds. You know what I mean? Or do I sit and just try to collect my thoughts and like, okay, can I regroup? What's going on? And then I hear the second thud. And then I hear these footsteps coming down the hall. And I always slept with my door open. So I'm laying there, my eyes open, and I'm just counting these footsteps as they walk down the hallway. And I see, out of my peripheral vision, I see my father's feet in the doorway, right? Because I recognize his shoes. And everything inside me is screaming, don't look up. Like, I don't go, And I firmly believe, all these years, if I do that, if I look up, I would not be sitting here today. Because it is absolutely nothing to make the hole a little bit bigger and say she left with her kid in the middle of the night. And probably would have taken my sister's life too, I'm sure, just to keep it all super clean, right? So I'm really grateful because, everything is inside of me. It's just like, because you obviously instinctively want to look up, right? You want to see what's happening. But I was like, do not, it's just like this, obviously probably my mother's soul saying, do not do this, honey.
Yep.
So I go back to sleep. The feet leave the doorway. I go back to sleep and I wake up a few hours later and I beeline straight to my mother's bedroom and I start rummaging through the sheets and looking. And the first thing that I noticed was my mother every day would get up and first thing, like make her bed. Right. And this is what I was instilled with. Like I still do that to this day. It's the first thing I do, get up, start your day. And, the bed was a mess. It was disheveled. And I'm like looking through the sheets and my sister was laying there because my sister would start off in her bedroom and then in the middle of the night come in and sleep, as most kids do, right? I think that's the thing they do, right? I don't have children, but that's what I hear at least. And I'm rummaging through the sheets and I'm looking for blood. I don't see anything. And I go downstairs and my father is in the living room and he's sitting there watching CNN or whatever. He's got a towel wrapped around his waist, like he just got out of the shower. And I say to him, where is my mother? And he doesn't say anything at first. I say, where is my mother? And he looks up at me and so coldly just, choose your, I don't even know how to describe it. He just looks up at me and he goes, well, mommy took a little vacation, Collier. And right then I knew. Now, was I 100% certain that he killed her? No. But I knew he did something to her, for sure. And then he launches into this whole like diatribe about, because I'm like, well, what happened? Where is she? And he starts explaining how she came down in the middle of the night. They got into a fight. She's screaming at him. she's throwing credit cards at him. And I say, well, what about the thuds? And he says to me, he goes, oh, she threw her purse at me. So that's what you heard is the purse. You know, I don't know about you guys. I mean, you guys carry manhole covers in your purses? I don't think so. And she, you know, and he starts saying, you know, it was the purse with this. And then, but she threw the purse at him and threw her credit cards, didn't grab a coat. He sees lights come through the window of the living room. She leaves out the back door, walks down our driveway, which is, you know, whatever. You're going to go all the way back around the house and walk in the dead of winter in Mansfield, Ohio, in the dead of winter, and gets in a car that was waiting and leaves in the middle of the night. Vanishes like a fart in the wind. I mean, I just do not believe a word he's saying, obviously.
Now, Collier, did you not believe? Number one, you didn't believe your mother would leave, I'm sure. But did you also believe that your father was capable of doing something horrific?
Oh, for sure.
Okay.
And something that had happened, you mentioned November, you know, and my mother filing for divorce in November. So, again, I didn't know that at the time. But one of the things that was happening is my father was, I could tell with my mother that because my father's saying the same things to me. You know, I'm going to destroy your life. You guys are going to live in poverty. You know, you'll never go to college, or, you know, you're going to go to public school. You know, you're going to have a horrible life. I'm going to make sure of it, that your life is ruined. And foreshadowing, I suppose. But he says, you know, so she was obviously dealing with the same type of abuse, right? So I could tell that, like, she was really kind of downtrodden. And this was around Thanksgiving of 1989. She picks me up from school, and we used to go to Bob Evans my mom didn't want to cook. My mom was a wonderful cook, but sometimes, and especially around this time, she just was like not feeling it, right? And we went to Bob Evans, and we were driving. This is a road called Hanley Road in Mansfield, and she says to me, she goes, Collier, I want you to know something. I would never leave you. And I said, well, of course not, Mommy. I know that. And she says, if anything ever happens to me, I want you to know that your father had me killed. Oh. And she starts saying how my father has mafia connections and that he's very dangerous and all of that. And that obviously stuck with me, right? So all that is sort of flooding through my head when she's leaving, and even that night, you know, early morning hours. So I am, you know, trying to reconcile all this and listening to my father just lie and bullshit. And so by this time, my grandmother comes in the living room, and he's like explaining everything again to my grandmother, and he's like goes into this whole, you know, we're not going to call the police, we're not going to call the FBI. And I remember specifically when my father says we're not going to call the FBI. Like, there's no CSI, there's no any of these crime shows out. But I just remember thinking to myself, we live in Mansfield, Ohio. That seems a little excessive. FBI. But you know, and again, it just is this, you know, the whole thing, and then he leaves.
Collier, I need to know really quickly, if you know, does your father have a history of being abused as a child?
Oh boy. All right. So to fast forward in time, as an adult, as I'm trying to reconcile all of this, I have this in my head because my grandfather was an alcoholic. I come to find out, my father's father. And I myself quit drinking years ago. But I remember for myself, I was a very happy-go-lucky, you know, just like the party and pass out party guy. But when I was making a murder in Mansfield, I went and saw my father's sister, who I hadn't seen in 25 years. And I was asking her about this because I was because when you are trying to reconcile this, especially as an adult, and you're like, okay, there has to be a reason, like why people do shit like this, right? There's got to be a reason. So I was expecting to hear that my grandfather, who I knew as a very jovial, fun guy, was like an abusive alcoholic. No. My aunt's like, he was the happiest. He never laid a finger on us. He was the happiest drunk. You know, he would just go pass out at the bar. He was a firefighter, and he just gave my grandmother, but would go and pull him out of the bars and give him vitamin B injections to keep him sane and all this stuff, you know. Come to find out, what I also found out is that my father was abusive to his two younger siblings. specifically in sexual ways. So
Okay.
I think that and you guys would obviously know more about this as criminologists, but I think that they're, one of the things is I think we all think about very, very prolific, I hate to use that word, but people who have committed mass crimes against societies, Hitler, Pol Pot, people, Khmer Rouge, people like that, right? That you're like, just wipes out people. Like, what kind of mentality is that? I think you just kind of go to yourself, some people, you realize, like, they're not groomed. They're born that way. And I think that was, my father went to seminary school, but that was after, and my parents came from very poor backgrounds, or very working class people. And my aunt was explaining to me how her parents just put all their money to get him out of the house, to get him so he wasn't there. You know what I mean? So, because he was trouble. So, and I, as much as you would like to sort of think that people learn these behaviors, and people do, of course, people do. People observe behaviors, they learn behaviors, and that's sort of what happens, right? Or they react to trauma. I think about that television show, You. I don't know if you guys ever watched that, but it just finished.
I just finished
season.
the 5th season.
Yeah, I just finished the 5th season, and it's like you kind of learn all this childhood trauma, which to me, I always think of, like, I watched a show like that, and I think about, like, well, yeah, but you're an asshole, like, because I would argue my story was worse, and I don't kill people, like, I don't do this,
right,
kind of like, fuck you, you know what I mean? I don't know if I can cuss on this program, but it's kind of like, so to examine that with the lens of my father was like, there had to be this thing, and then when I remember finding out there wasn't that thing, I was just like, oh man,
It would almost make it easier if there were.
Yeah.
that
it
thing.
would. Because it
Yeah.
humanizes someone. Okay, he had a rough go,
Thank you for answering that.
in a
Yeah.
very roundabout way, but yes.
Yeah, no. So obviously there's so much to this story, and we're like barely scratching the surface on this. So I'm going to be leaving out some details just because this isn't a serialized, show. Because I will tell people to hear all the details, they must listen to that podcast. Name it again?
Finding Mom's Killer.
I keep wanting to say Finding Mother's Killer, Finding Mom's Killer.
Finding
Okay.
Mom's Killer. You can watch my
Okay.
film, A Murder in Mansfield. You
Yes,
can listen
murder.
to my
Yeah, we're
podcast,
going to have
Collier
links to
Landry
all
Show.
of that. But basically, because of your suspicion, you had a very close relationship with Lieutenant Dave Messmore.
Yeah.
And you would kind of give him information. And had it not been for you, I think it's safe to say that this case would have never been solved and there would never be justice for your mother because, Jack, when he was questioned, your father, he told the police the same story. Yeah. They got into an argument. She left her on her own accord. But obviously, there was some shady stuff going on. And this all came to a head when you found a picture in your dad's car.
Yeah, and I just want to take it back, and I'll give the cliff notes on this for the sake of time. But, essentially, that morning he says, don't call the police. And I basically go, and he leaves the house, and I lock myself into the bathroom with the cordless phone. I call all my mother's friends, and police are dispatched to the house. They don't believe me. And I always say that nobody believed me except for one detective, and that's true. And I end up coming to find out that not only was Dave Messmore the only person that believed me, but the prosecutor didn't want to take this case either because he's like, this is a doctor, and the captain of the police department, this is a doctor. We don't do this. And you think about the fact that this police officer put his career on the line for the word of a soon-to-be 12-year-old child who is telling him all this. It was extraordinary because when Dave came to the house, my grandmother went to call my father. She was apoplectic that he was there. This is the first time because this is after the black and whites show up and then they leave. And, 2 days later, he comes around and sniffing. And I say, look, give me your card. Tomorrow I go to school and I will call you and I will give you everything. And I told him everything. And my father's proclivity for violence, Sherry, the ring, the this, the that, all this stuff. So we formed this bond over 25 days. Solving my mother's murder because I was able to go to school, which is a safe zone when you think about now, like, you think about children having access or being believed by law enforcement when, let's just keep it real. These missing persons cases are 95% women. Your audience knows this. They're astute, and they don't have this opportunity. They don't have this voice speaking up for them, this advocate. It's the husband who's being prevaricative in his questioning and, oh, well, things weren't great, but no, she has no reason to leave her. Oh, she did it before. She'll be back, as my father's story was. And then it falls by the wayside in the caseload of a police department, right? So I'm very fortunate that Dave Messmore believed me and then was an advocate. But yeah, halfway through the month and I'm telling Dave, I'm studying my father every night. I'm looking, he's got scratches on his arms, bruises. He is sore one day. He's watching me play a violent video game, which he loved violence. And all of a sudden he's like, I would never have bought you this game. And I'm thinking to myself, who are you? And he's turned to this very passive person, weird. He's talking every night about how my mother, I wonder where mommy's having dinner at tonight. I wonder where she's staying. Oh, but always like, it's just such a shame she left our family in such a state. It's just, it's insanity. But I'm telling Dave all this information. But one night my father says, I'm going to go to my office and grab some paperwork. I said, well, I'm going to go with him. And he, on the way back, he stops at a gas station to get gas, and he walks inside, and I'm watching him, and I just start rummaging through his truck, and I open up the center console, and I find 2 photographs. One is of a house that I've never seen before, and the second is of his girlfriend, Sherry Campbell, and her 2 children sitting in front of a fireplace that's wrapped in plastic. And so me, in my head, I'm like, this is the same. And that's when I told Dave. But Dave had already also found the house and all this. So, but now it's all like tying together, right? Because now he's got Sherry at the house, all this stuff, right? The girlfriend.
And this is the house in Pennsylvania that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, in Erie, Pennsylvania. So, it was this wild, just sort of, and it was so weird because the year before, like Batman came out, summer of 1989, and I really latched onto the narrative of Batman, not ever thinking that I would be orphaned and be trying to and be a little Batman myself, little Bruce Wayne, trying to figure all this out. But like that's what it was to me. It was like, and every night my father is coming home, and I don't know if I'm going to wake up in the morning. That's the scariest thing, or he's going to figure out because as the weeks go on during this investigation, in the background, Dave is coming to my house every night, by the way, having talked to me at school earlier in the day, coming to my house to talk to my dad. And my dad is, he's got his lawyer there and they're like, please go away. But he's persistent. And I see him at the door. And I'm like, I just talked to you like 3 hours earlier or whatever it was at school. So we had this, the trust level for him to not say, well, I spoke to your son. And then, you know what I mean? And the trust that I had to not say anything to my father, you know what I mean? There was this mutual sort of respect and trust and bond that we were creating because we both had a common goal, which is find out what happened to my mother.
Well, and your life was on the line, and that was very
absolutely.
clear. So that's why for him, he needed to move fast because he was worried for your safety, and they needed to secure evidence to arrest your father. And that first started with a search warrant that was executed on the Pennsylvania home January 25th of 1990. And now the warrant focused specifically on the basement since Jack had inquired about the foundation. And there were some strange things in the basement. So for one, the floors had been newly concreted. There was a green turf-like outdoor carpet that had been laid. There was also a random shelf that was built halfway in a corner. So basically, investigators demolished the shelf and they removed the carpet. And they also noticed that there was a fresh coat of concrete, and it was unusually soft. Officers excavated that area, and 3 hours of digging later, they uncovered a nude, badly decomposed female body. And DNA tests, unfortunately, would later confirm that the deceased woman was, in fact, your mother, Noreen Boyle. Her autopsy would show that her cause of death was suffocation with previous blunt force trauma to her head. Jack Boyle was immediately arrested and charged with first-degree murder. So now this takes us to the trial. And Jack opted for a trial, which began in June of 1990. And the prosecution's key witness, who is here with us today, was little Collier. And as he explained to us just a moment ago, you testified about the sounds you heard on that evening. Also some suspicious remarks following the incident, your father's abusive behavior, the extramarital relationships. I mean, I could not imagine what this must have been like for a child. Was your father looking at you while you testified? Were you looking down? Like, what, I don't know if there's any words that could really explain what that feeling was like, but if you can give it a try, just tell us a little bit about that experience.
My father refused to make eye contact with me.
That's interesting. I thought he would have stared you down.
I was daggers at him the whole time.
Okay.
And, you know, just to sort of add, the first search warrant was served at my house where I was, and I was removed by Children's Services as as they were in the house searching, because why they expedited the search warrant was because my father was going to take me for a father and son bonding trip to Florida. And I had called Dave and I said, I've been able to swim since I was 5 years old, and I'm going to drown in the Gulf of Mexico. You'll never see me again. I'm not coming back from Florida. I was terrified.
Oh gosh, I don't blame you. Where did you go to? Who did you stay with?
So I went to the principal of my school's house that day, and then they ended up being the foster parents, the foster home that I lived in.
Were they family friends or just your principal?
My mom knew her from the school board. My mom was helping them also to try and adopt a baby from Taiwan, and they would babysit Elizabeth from time to time as well. I wouldn't say friends, but
Okay. And so at the trial, there was other key evidence I'm just going to very briefly go through. It was found out that about a month before Noreen's murder, Jack had sent a letter to his patients letting him know he would be closing his local office. December 29th, a day prior to the murder, he leased a jackhammer. The next day, he called his real estate agent and asked what kind of soil was under the basement floor, which seems like a strange thing to ask. And of course, there was mountains of evidence surrounding the bitter divorce proceedings, the fighting, the financial issues. We already talked about the fact that Jack had several extramarital affairs. So I think there was more than enough to show motive and clearly also premeditation based on, some of this evidence that was emerging. Jack took the stand in his own defense, contending that he did not murder Noreen and that somebody else must have done so and planted evidence in the home.
And I'm sorry, and put your mother's body in his home? Someone else did that? That was actually his contention?
Mm-hmm. Is that correct, Collier?
Yeah, I mean it's so bad.
Wow,
yeah, it's quite brazen. But I don't think anyone will be surprised to know that this did not convince the jury, who found him guilty of first-degree murder and felony abuse of a corpse, and sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for 20 years, consecutive to an 18-month term for abusing a corpse. And now, Collier, you were an orphan, right? You and your sister were placed in foster homes, as I believe you spent some time in Dave Mesmore's family's home. Is that correct?
So I wanted the Mesmores to adopt me, but I was in foster care in another home, the one we were taken to that first day, and those foster parents wanted custody of my sister. And but after the trial and everything, I was allowed to go and spend time with Dave Mesmore and his family because I wanted them to adopt me, because I was just like, okay, let me just have a little bit of a silver lining. They had 2 older kids. So
and he saved your life, it felt like, I'm sure.
He saved my life.
Yeah.
He helped me solve, I mean, it's crazy. Like when I talk about it, like he was there for me in that way of like, in my most crucial, one of the most crucial times in my life, or the most crucial time in my life, to be able to listen to me and to help me get justice for my mother. And, so yeah, I really loved them and I loved their family and everything. And so I asked them if they would adopt me. They said yes. So they filed for all of that. And I was awarded custody to another family. The judge said to me, "You don't think I'm actually going to send you with the guy who put your dad away, do you?" Turns out that the judge had been investigated by Dave Mesmore on a corruption charge a few years previously. So
I was going to say, why not? We know of cases where prosecutors adopted victims. That happened in the Diane Downs case.
And that would have been in the best interest of the victim.
Yeah, I don't actually see why that wouldn't have been a possibility. Well, maybe now I do. But anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, so it's, but look, I mean, I always say this, I went to another home. I was adopted by the Zieglers, and and also a great family to land, and it was hard because I kind of wanted that happy ending, because I just, You just never really, but I mean, I don't regret it. I mean, look, things always work out the way they should, but yeah, it was a thing. And maybe it would have been something that my father has done a great job of haunting my life for the rest of my life, but maybe it would have even been worse if I had ended up with Dave Messmore, when you think about that, or could have given him even, if I was awarded custody there, to even get a new trial, perhaps,
Oh, that's an interesting point.
They could have said, oh, he coerced, there was so much fanfare and so much scuttlebutt, if you will, around my testimony at the trial. I testified for 2 days at trial against my father. And people, to this day, they're still like, well, you sure you weren't coached? And they didn't say this. Well, first of all, you are prepped by the prosecutor, as every witness is.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. Like, this is your statement. Do you remember saying this? Yes, I do. I do remember saying this. But as I explain to people all the time, and even people that come to me and like, hey, I'm going to be a witness. What do I do? I was like, the first thing is the reason why it sounds so believable is because it's the truth, and the truth is the easiest thing to remember.
Yeah.
So you don't have to make something up. And I see this in trials that are going on now where people are but they're like, well, look at how but the sociopath they are. They're on the witness stand making up this story. There's a trial that's going on right now, and they're attacking all these witnesses, and their story is just so put together. And so if you're telling the truth, it's really easy to remember your story. It really is. And and witnesses and a prosecutor saying, well, do you remember saying this and this? That's not coaching, because this all started with me. It wasn't like the police came to me after investigating a call from someone else and said, did you hear anything that night, Collier? Could you have heard any thuds in the middle of the night around 3 a.m.? Well, maybe, I don't know. Did you hear a scream? No. I was the one who told that story because I was the first person to contact law enforcement by way of my mother's friends. I was the first person to give that statement. So these years of gaslighting by my father, or years of people being suspicious of my testimony or what I said, or thinking it was somehow contrived, it's utterly fanciful, because it started with me and the story's never changed.
And you mentioned this a little bit, but we're going to get into it now, that not long after the sentencing, you actually wrote to your father in prison.
I did.
And what was the purpose of writing, and did you get what you were looking for out of that?
I mean, that ended up kicking off I went to see my father in prison with my, first time was with my social worker. Second time was with my adoptive father, George. But yeah, I went to see him in prison. One of the things that I realized at a really young age, as to not be the character in you, is you have to deal with this stuff head on at a very early age. And because I had been abandoned by both sides of my family, because of my testimony, because of me looking like my father, et cetera, I knew I had to be the adult very on. And I knew that if I didn't get a handle on this early, it was just going to eat me alive. So I set out to really try to understand why my father perpetrated this crime, try to really understand what his thought process was, trying to get him to make some sort of confession or show some contrition for his responsibility and say, look, I'm sorry. I wrote him letters and just said, not only have you affected my life and my mother's life and the family's life and Sherry's life and my newborn sister's life and all these people, but also your own life. Like, you threw everything away for what? Please tell me. Make it make sense to me. And I realized that, I had to get to a place where I forgave my father. And I think a lot of people, they stumble over that. They're like, well, why would you? He's such a heinous monster, and how dare he? It's not about him. It's not about him. It's about me. It's about me saying, I'm going to put this behind me and move on with my life. Now, look, I talk about this on shows, I talk about this on interviews, I made a movie, blah, blah. So, I understand that people are like, well, you still talk about it, but it's in a way to share with people about how they can overcome these types of traumas versus like, let me sit and stew in this and marinate on how shitty my life is because I got dealt a really crappy hand by the dealer. You know, I think that, you know, I had to figure out a way to make it all make sense to me. And for me as an artist, you know, it was to put together a film and then obviously podcasts and things like that, because I was able to, you know, and I cultivated this relationship with my father for decades. You know, I would go see him every chance you know, opportunity I had, you know, I would see him in college. And then we, you know, I moved out to California. I didn't see him as much. You know, we would communicate via telephone or letters or things like that. Then when the proliferation of the prison email system, we email. My father was up for parole in 2010, and I actually started. This is right when I became a filmmaker, and I started filming stuff. And I went to the parole board, and I filmed the whole thing, and I actually advocated for his release. Now, there's a caveat to that. I went to my father and I asked him. And he, for the first time in 2010, he admitted to having some sort of culpability. He said, I'm responsible for your mother's death. Now, I'm responsible because I drove her to this position, or I did this or that. It was never like I killed her. But I was like, okay, I am in no way able to financially support this man. And there's about 400 people that are going to say, don't let him out. But if I curry favor with my father, I can get him to maybe start to inch closer to the truth and to the ultimate question, which is, why did you murder my mother? Which is what drove me to make the film with two-time Oscar winner Barbara Koppel. Called Murder in Mansfield. We made it with ID. And, you know, all that was to like drive me into to try to find these answers to like why. Because I thought, okay, if I know why my father murdered my mother, you know, I've already done to the forgiveness part, but I still want to understand this, because something that is very rarely talked about is when you are a child of, but not only the victim, but also the perpetrator, you are placed, because I grew up where I stayed in the same town that all this happened. So I would get strange looks and you know, walk into, I mean, everyone knew who I was for all the wrong reasons, by the way. Nobody wants to be known for this shit. And I remember it carries with it this stigma that people don't realize, you know, the number of times that I've had girlfriends who have heard they're having a conversation with their father saying, are you sure you want to date this guy? Look what his dad did. You know, how could you take this guy seriously? How, you know, you know what I'm saying? Like, nobody thinks about like those types of things when it comes to these crimes, is the effects that this happens on the people who are involved, right? Or look what they are involved in. And even Sherry, you know, who, you know, no love lost there, but also like a person who is the mother of my half sister, who also lived with this, and like under this veil of like, oh, did she know about this? And if she had nothing to do with it, which I believe she did, or didn't have anything to do with it in that way, at least not trying to murder my mother, you know, now she lives under this veil of suspicion. It's just, all these things happen, right? So for me, it was very important to try to bifurcate that from myself of like, okay, how do I figure out how I'm not like this person or capable of doing such a thing? And that was to try to understand why he did it.
And Collier, it took for many years, he denied having anything to do with it. And he even asked you to recant your testimony. Is that correct?
So many times over the years.
Okay.
So many times over the years. In fact, my uncle, who is my godfather, who abandoned me during all of this, who is my mother's best friend, and my father's younger brother, he, you know, he passed away a couple of months ago. He went to his grave believing that I framed my father for my mother's murder.
Wow.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. And even, you know, it's like, and his sister said to him, you know, Collier made a film and Jack confessed, right? You know that. Like, he said that he did it. And he was so gaslit by my father, even telling me so much as the last time I spoke to him, which was during the pandemic, that he saw my mother. You know, he came out after the trial and said that he saw my mother outside his office 3 days after she was supposedly murdered. And
I mean, I know you've forgiven people, but shame on him. I'm sorry.
I'd like to think when he got to heaven that my mother set him straight. But
Hope so. I like
And
to
that's
think
nice of you to think he still got to go to heaven.
but it's it's one of those things. Yeah, and you don't think about that, but yeah, my father I made it all up. It was the one-armed man. It was this. And that's crazy making, because then sometimes you just start to think, well, did I make it up? Knowing full well what I heard, but you question yourself, because anybody who is a normal person, or I'm sorry, a regular person, I don't like to use the word normal, but a regular person that doesn't think this way, of course, has empathy and thinking, well, maybe could I have been responsible for this? And by the way, this sucks to think or to live like this. But you start to think that, have I been making all this? Like, did I imagine something that didn't happen? So I think that's a really, it's a hard row to hoe, as I like to say, and it is something that you just don't think about.
Eventually, you did get somewhat of a confession.
I did.
From your father. Is that correct?
Yeah. So in the film, he tells this whole story. It happened downstairs, and because I pull out a letter that I wrote him when I was 13, asking him to admit it, saying so we can all move on with our lives, so we can all reunite as a family, so everybody can just put this to bed and we can begin to heal. And he opened the letter, put it back in the envelope, wrote refused, and sent it back to me. So I read him that letter in the film and ask him why. And of course he makes it about himself, saying that he was suicidal at the time. He was in a really dark place when he wrote that. It's just
You're like, you want to talk about a dark place, right? That's absurd.
It's mind numbing.
Yeah.
It's crazy making. But he goes into that, and you're just like, oh boy, okay. But he tells this whole story about how she came downstairs again, the same thing, throwing the purse. He says
she attacked him, right?
At it with a knife.
Yeah.
He pushed her. She hit her head. Professor Green in the dining room with the candlestick came in and whacked her on the back. I mean, it's just you're just.
The closest you're going to get to the truth, obviously.
Sure.
And if I can just read a quick quote that he said on the podcast, and this might have also been in your actual film.
Sure.
Did he talk to the host of the podcast, or was that audio pulled from your movie?
No, he did. He talked to him.
All right. So he says, quote, Noreen's death will always remain. And this is what your father said. Noreen's death will always remain a tragedy forever into eternity. And I'm the one responsible for that, accidental or otherwise. So, yes, as we see here is classic psychopathy, where he's saying he's responsible, but then quick to say accidental or otherwise. So clearly no one buys this story, not the detectives, and certainly not you, Collier. Is that correct?
That would be correct, yes.
That is correct, yes. But despite that, you still speak with him fairly frequently by
Well,
phone?
I mean, I've been speaking with him because I had to speak with him because of this podcast.
Not
so
this podcast, that podcast.
No, because of that podcast.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, it's like,
had
not
to,
ours.
What
no,
are you
no,
doing?
Oh, no, I'm not putting that on you guys.
Thank you.
So I've been speaking to him, and it was also that the uncle, that my uncle was sick, and then it was this whole thing. So I was like, it's like the scene in The Godfather Part 3, which the only memorable thing about Part 3 is every time I'm out, they pull me back in. And that's what I feel like. And I'm just like, oy vey, like now I got to just deal with this,
And he is now, what, 81? Is that
he's
correct?
82. He just turned 82 like 2 weeks ago.
Oh, happy birthday. No, I'm just kidding. 81. Okay.
Yeah, 2 weeks ago today, actually.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
And he's
There
up
you
for
go.
parole again?
He's up for parole in August. So it's like that was one of the things I have to deal with now. It's like, and again, to try to assess him. And look, the first time I knew he wasn't going to get out, and it was no skin off my back to say, yeah, because I want to make a movie and I want to, curry favor with him, Second time around, I didn't say anything to the parole board, didn't speak to them at all. And I don't know, we all got our letters a few weeks ago from the parole board as well that he's up for in August. So I guess I'll have to navigate through that very soon, figure out what I'm going to do, if anything, or,
Does he have a plan for release? Does he have a proposed plan of where he's going to live?
Yeah, he thinks he's going to get job, and he's working on all this because there's programs that he's been involved in since he's been in the prison system. And
Okay.
One of the things that I will say is my father is still very sharp, which bodes well for me into old age, thank God. So that was it's nice to hear him and be like, okay, well, he's still coherent. But yeah, he works with in the system. He's found a way to mentor other prisoners and all of this, and there's a religious background to all of that. But yes, he works with certain organizations outside, and these organizations are designed for people who to have a place to go and to reduce recidivism rates. And but I think this begs to a larger question, which we've discussed before, I mean offline, but is someone who has been incarcerated for 35 years, forget the fact that he's having trouble admitting his guilt or innocence or whatever, just from a standpoint of being 82 years old, being released back into a society. When he left that society, computers were sitting on a desk, and now they're in the palm of our hands, and they're 5 million times more powerful. The whole world has changed in a way that you have no clue about, that you've seen. And, he's telling me, well, I'll get a job. And I'm thinking to myself, I can't get a job. You know what I mean? It's so hard to get a job nowadays. It's like, what are you going to do? And so part of me is like, is it even humane to release someone like that back into society when they've been, look, ironically, the Shawshank Redemption talks about this, and that was, as I said, ironically, was filmed in Mansfield, Ohio. And, you think about the character of Brooks getting out after 50 years and just can't bag groceries, that just can't understand that, as we say, the world went and got itself in a big damn hurry. Think about what it is now. It's tough for anyone to come out. A young person who hasn't had my father had skills and he's educated, but it's,
I think as the primary victim, the primary surviving victim here, whether or not he deserves to be out, I think a lot of that, when we talk about justice, it's like, well, how does it feel for you? Do you think that he's at the point where he should be allowed to rejoin society? Because, there's different purposes of punishment. There's deterrence. Like, do we think that he's going to reoffend? Probably not at this age. So is he a danger to society? Not likely, given what we know, right? But that doesn't mean that he deserves to be out, given what he has done to your life and the other victims in this case. All right, so it's a difficult question.
Two things. If your father goes in with that same story and does not take responsibility for his crime, he's not going to get parole. I can just tell you that. So you may not have to worry about that at all. Because if he thinks he's going to go in and say accidental or not, they're going to say 35 years later and you're still not
he's smart. I think he's smart enough to know what he needs to do. And
I would imagine he is, but most parole boards expect you to say it. I also think that I actually disagree with Amy, and I realize that physically most people age out of crime. And is he a physical threat? Would he be able to, snuff the life out of someone again? Probably not. But I think your father is probably an ongoing danger always, actually, until the day he dies. I would.
You're saying emotionally and.
I think he's a dangerous man, and I think that propensity for I think there's still always going to be a propensity given the situation, especially if he's still sharp-witted and still has capabilities. I don't know. He's just doesn't. I think he's a career criminal. I just don't think that he would be not a threat. There's some people I think are totally reformed, and even if he's gone through all the programs and whatnot, based on the information that you gave me throughout the years and the things he said and done, I don't know that I would think he still doesn't pose a threat to someone. And maybe, that someone even could be you or another family member. So
I will tell you this. I would not let him come over for a sleepover.
There you go. There it is. Yeah.
I wouldn't be in a hotel room with him. I wouldn't stay with him. I wouldn't. I do think that there is, and Dave Messmore is very convinced of this. Like, he thinks he's a danger, and thinks that my life could be in danger if he gets out. because he, even with his dying breath, if he gets his vengeance, you know what I mean? There again, it's very hard. It's very hard to understand. And again, you guys understand this even more than I do. It's very hard to understand the lengths that someone will go to for vengeance when they feel wronged. And I think my father legitimately feels wronged.
Mm-hmm.
And he feels that you're to blame. You're the reason why he spent so many years in prison.
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Well, that's very unfortunate. Because clearly, because of you, there was justice for your mother. So, and, we usually, when we wind down, we talk about, did the system get it right? I think we have to give, especially Lieutenant Mesmore in this case, taking a kid seriously is, as we talked about, not everyone would do that. Not everyone would put their career on the line. And, I think it talks to his character. I think it's a testament to your character that at such a young age. And for anyone who's listening, I hope you watch the documentary, listen to the podcast. The way you spoke as an 11-year-old is so much better than I speak as a 44-year-old. You were like, it was incredible to me. And I think that's why people had trouble with it, because you were so intelligent. And the way you spoke, you just seemed like you were like 20 years older than you were.
I mean, I will say that not much evolution has occurred from that point till now. Just so
it doesn't matter. You were still so smart then. It's fine. If you were frozen in time there, you're still ahead of most of us. So it's fine. But it was really incredible to listen to you speak at that age. Meghan, have you had a chance yet to listen, or were you waiting until?
So I waited. I actually want, if we remember, we discussed it, and Amy and I were like almost, who's going to cover this case? Amy covered it, and I wanted to then therefore wait. The only thing I did was I did look at some initial coverage, newspapers, and I think I mentioned this to you, Collier. There is a picture of you and your mother that absolutely warmed my heart and still almost like brings a tear to my eye, because I could see it. Everything you talked about, your relationship with her, I could feel it. I could feel the love by this one photo. And I mean, she just looked like such an incredible, your bond looks so incredible. And so that is, was the extent of what I've seen. But now that we have done this, it's go time. It's documentary time. It's podcast time, because I want to hear every bit more of everything you had to say. And I so appreciate your willingness to share it with us.
Yes. Collier, can you tell people where they can find you? We'll have some links in our show notes to some of your projects, but tell people where they could find you and see what you're up to.
You can find me on all platforms at Collier Landry. So, Tik Tok, YouTube. I have a YouTube channel. A podcast is called Collier Landry Show, or The Collier Landry Show. Get on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast from. And you can find me. I am out there. I'm very active, and reach out. You have any questions? I do coaching for people that have been through trauma and are going to be witnesses, or I do a lot of work and advocacy for people to understand the justice system, but also to heal from personal trauma and mental health work. Look, I'm not, as I always say on my show, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a psychologist. I do not work in law enforcement. I'm just a guy who's been through a lot of shit.
I was going to say a shitload of lived experience. I think that trumps all of the other stuff.
And that's what I try to offer people, and just, and I'll just sort of leave it at this, which is I think that the biggest takeaway for me in doing all of this is, I wanted to show people that you can go through seemingly insurmountable odds and deal with unspeakable tragedy and come out the other side. And look, you're going to be bruised, you're going to have a couple broken bones, you're going to be scraped up, but you're going to make it. You're going to be okay. You do not have to be a prisoner of your circumstances. And I think that's what it means to be my mother's son.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Collier. What a great way to end out here. Thank you so much for being here with us. It's really such a gift to our listeners and our viewers that they get to hear your stories. And I really appreciate it. Thank you, Collier.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope to catch you next time on Women in Crime.
Women in Crime is written and hosted by Meghan Sachs and Amy Shlosberg. Our producer is James Varga. Script editing is by Abagail Belcastro. Audio editing is by Siler Burr and Jose Alfonzo. And music is by Desert Media. If you enjoy the show, please remember to follow and leave a review. You can also support the show through Patreon, where you can get access to additional ad-free content such as exclusive full-length episodes, lectures, a book club, and virtual happy hours with Meghan and Amy. For more information, visit patreon.com/women-and-crime.
Sources for today's episode include CNN, the Mansfield News Journal, the podcast Finding Mom's Killer, Oxygen, Forensic Files, and the documentary A Murder in Mansfield.